Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Schown. I'm joined by Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hey.
Hello, hello. Today we are starting our new series, Contemporary Utopias, with a review of Toni Morrison's Paradise. We'll be talking about this book for 3 weeks before moving on to our next utopian fiction, Kirinyaga by Mike Resnick. If this is your first time joining us, we are also a literary book club on Reddit. You can find our discussion there by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can support us and your local bookstore by using our bookshop.org link, which is in our episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. So let's talk about Morrison's Paradise. Yet, what's Paradise about?
I think in the broadest way of thinking, at its core, Paradise is a novel about competing worldviews and competing ideologies. In the novel, there's a group of Black people who live in Ruby, Oklahoma, and they live in an all-Black town, and they have deliberately excluded themselves from the rest of the white 1970s America that they're surrounded by. This deliberate isolation is in response, of course, to the history of white supremacy in America, but also it's a desire that they have to separate themselves according to what they think of as their racial purity, because they have a much darker skin tone than lots of other Black people in their area. And they had been previously excluded even from a lot of the other small all-Black towns in Oklahoma that were full of lighter-skinned Black folks. So these townspeople in particular are led by two twin brothers, Deacon and Stuart Morgan. They keep an uneasy grip on the past and the kind of foundation myth that they have established for their utopian town. And the way that they think about the world stands at odds with the younger generation of people who live in Ruby, but more specifically, I think, with their nearest neighbors at a former convent, which is now full of women who have arrived there and live there after escaping various traumas in their own lives. So in contrast to the people in Ruby, I think the convent is a place of radical openness and acceptance. A conflict between the two is inevitable, and this is teased at the beginning of the novel before Morrison takes a very large step backwards, and she spends the rest of the novel examining the historical foundation of these ideologies and their conflicts.
So this book was the third in what I guess Morrison herself has called the Beloved trilogy, Beloved being the first book and Jazz being the second. This book by itself is not actually very important in the greater scope of Morrison's work. It's not as well regarded, and it's not studied as much as her other books. How many of her other books have you read? I've read 2. I read Song of Solomon in high school and Beloved in college. And I remember liking them both, but that's all I really remember.
This is the fourth of her novels that I've read. I read Sula, Song of Solomon, and Beloved as well.
Yeah, I've read Beloved as well, and Sula, and I believe I've read Bluest Eye.
So how do you think this book compares to these other books?
I don't think it's a dramatic difference in quality. I think that with Morrison, she has a particular subject matter. She has particular gifts as a writer, and she spent her career mining those specific gifts. I don't think that she attempts for a wide range of styles or subjects, and I think that this novel is of a piece with that, and it didn't bother me or stand out as being worse or different in any way, really.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I do think I appreciate her more the older I get, the more I'm able to put my opinions aside and look at the way she's crafting a sentence, especially at the sentence level.
So for me, I actually don't recall Beloved or Song of Solomon at all. And this is something that you and I talked about previously, Sam, off the air.
Yes.
Even though I've read both and I've written papers about both, and I remember writing papers about them,
Same.
I have no recollection of those 2 books. But one thing I would say is in looking at this book, her obvious strengths are her prose, as you said, Sam, and also the way she sets up her scenes, her close attention to detail. she does a really good job placing you in a scene with imagery. And also, it's kind of interesting. This is something I do remember. She shifts points of view quite frequently, and it is kind of jarring and distracting, but in a good way. Like it unsettles you. The problem for me in this book, and I can't say that I've noticed it in the other two books I've read because they were such a long time ago. And also, I think I'm a more careful reader now. The problem is that when I finished this book, I thought it came off as incredibly preachy, and I felt like I was being lectured. Like one sentence, for example, is at the end, she says, they think they have outfoxed the white man when they imitate them. Like, she's kind of just telling you the theme right there. At the end, this is said by Reverend Meisner or Misner. Like, she does these things where she would just explicitly tell you, hey, this is what I'm talking about, which is kind of clumsy. And I feel like having just criticized Donna Tartt for doing this, maybe it's because I read this, so soon after Tartt, but having just criticized Tartt, like, I don't think I can let that slide. It's the same problem. She set up these ideas in the book, and at the end, she feels the need to underline it for us. And I don't remember this in Beloved or Song of Solomon, but once again, I don't remember much about those two books. But I remember those as being something where you kind of have to dig to get the meaning of the book. Like, dig more than you have to in this book, which is really obvious.
I actually might disagree with you. I think there is a surface level understanding here, but I think some of my appreciation of this book comes after digging and reading outside papers about it.
Yeah, I think I disagree with you as well, James. I think the novel, it is explicit about the ideas that it's offering to the reader, but I think the reason why it can afford to be explicit is because these are ideas that would not occur to the reader before encountering the novel. And because it is a way of thinking that is distinctly Morrison's and something that has been elaborated over the course of her entire career, I'm willing to allow her to take moments to speak more directly to the theme and speak more directly to the ideas of the novel, because this is not just a one-off thing, but this is kind of the breadth of her artistry.
Yeah, maybe. I'm still fairly skeptical, as you can tell from the maybe. I'm reticent to say that over explaining in a novel, even in the hands of a master, is warranted. And for me, in this book, there's a lot of over explaining. Interestingly enough, after having read this book, and I actually found this kind of hard to read just because of the over explaining. To borrow a Sam phrase, there was a lot of eye rolling going on when I was reading this book. I looked at some reviews. The LA Times called it sentimental and didactic, which I agree with, definitely didactic. And Kakutani in the New York Times criticized the plot for being contrived, the characters as being cliched, and also for being overly didactic. I think the plot for me is okay, but I agree with her in terms of the characters because they are very either good or evil. They are quite two-dimensional, which is what Kakutani criticized it for. And once again, the didacticism is definitely present for me and definitely unenjoyable for me.
I suppose the didacticism is a charge that carries weight insofar as you see or do not see Morrison as having something to teach. And I accept that she has crafted this and the plot is contrived. I agree with that. And the characters are often a bit flat because they are meant to illustrate something. But that illustration to me is valuable enough that I am willing to let this work in the way that I think Morrison wants it to work, because I think Morrison wants to show us something, and it might not make for a good art experience, but I do think it makes for a decent learning experience. Morrison, as a writer, is, I think, speaking to a reader who is quite different from us. And I do think that what Morrison has to offer is distinct from what I usually latch on to. And that to me is okay because I acknowledge my own particular biases. She knows what she wants to do, And she focuses very exclusively on, as I said before, a very certain set of themes, a very certain set of topics. And that to me is fine because I think that there are things that she does very well. We've mentioned the prose, the images, and the theme. They're always done very well, in my opinion. The things that I don't enjoy are the pacing and the structure of the narrative. Especially in this novel, I suppose the thing that was most difficult for me was the characterization, just in terms of the mechanics of keeping everybody straight, because there are so many characters. The biggest challenge for me, though, and here I will say it's a challenge for me because it's also something very important in her work, is the way she uses scenes. And it's challenging because she moves through many layers of history very fluidly. And she does this on purpose because I think what she wants to do is to show us how the past is alive to us at every moment. This is, I think, like the most important thing to understand about her work, but it's also the thing that makes her work most challenging for me as a reader.
It's quite interesting that we read this book after reading As I Lay Dying, because that book also has multiple points of view. It also moves forward and back in time, but it does so less frequently. It uses chapter breaks to sort of structure that movement, whereas Morrison does it in chapter with very long chapters. And that purposefully makes it more difficult to read and more difficult to follow along, because when Morrison shifts from one point of view to the other, you kind of have to catch up. She doesn't give you a lot of hints as to who it's shifting to.
I agree with both of you. It's kind of strange having this opaque heading or chapter title like Grace, and then you do get details about Grace, but the chapter itself is about a lot more than that. You don't just get Grace's point of view or just Grace's past. You're getting a whole heap of history and other people's perspectives.
What seems missing is a subordination of events, and to say, well, this happened because of this, and then this happened later because of that. Things are given to you kind of at once in a sequence that doesn't really seem logical. And because there isn't that sequencing, it often feels very messy when you read it. It's like you have to really follow each thread and untangle it by yourself rather than a novel that is more kind of architecturally framed.
Yeah, and that's a contrast as well to As I Lay Dying, which is mostly sequential because they are moving forward in time as they're laying their mother to rest.
There's one main motion. It's a group of people moving from one location to another. Whereas here, this is dealing with history and a lot of backstory and, like we've talked about, time shifts, moving between characters, moving between time periods, even moving different states entirely.
So, what is the verdict on this kind of confusion? Do you think that it is detrimental?
For me personally, yes. But as Iad pointed out earlier, more so than a lot of other writers, Morrison is someone who knows what she's doing and there's a point to it. It doesn't appeal to me the same way that it doesn't appeal to Iad, but she's not a compromising person. She's taking these risks because she's crafting an argument and she knows how she wants that argument to be laid out. It makes for very confusing and ultimately a bit too difficult reading for me. Parsing it out is a little bit of the, if you could call it, fun. I'm putting that in really big quotations. It's a bit too frustrating for me.
Well, let me give you an example. After finishing this novel, I started another novel, The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. And that to me is quite an obvious difference in that it is very clearly structured for dramatic effects. And that is much easier to follow along. But what's missing in the contrast that I see with Paradise is that Paradise has something of the flavor of human life. It says something about human life in the way that the past lives with us, that once you're attuned to it, because you've experienced it in Morrison's work, you will notice its absence elsewhere. And it feels much more of a sincere representation of human life than The Master and Margarita does, just because it feels organic in that way.
We talked earlier about how this book hasn't gotten as much critical attention as her other books. You might say that it's a minor work by a very major author. Can we make an argument for this book as being worthy of readership and discussion? What makes this book important?
There is a professor in the University of Kansas named Dr. Keith Byerman who talks about how teaching this book is what he calls a high risk proposition, in part because it has these very important central concerns and themes, but they can't be considered separate. They are inextricably linked. And these themes are about as important as it gets: violence, race, color, purity, gender, sexuality, class, family, community, religion, ritual. There's so many things going on in this book. And honestly, that's also partly what makes it frustrating for me. But the fact that they're all connected, that you can't talk about the violence without talking about race, without talking about gender, it's all swirling together. It's all connected. Even though that makes for a frustrating read and a frustrating teaching experience or breaking down of these subjects, it makes the book stand out to me that you can't just talk about any one of these things.
Yeah, the way I would put it is it really shows you the complexity of both the Black experience at that time when the book was set, which was the 70s, but also the Black female experience, which is different because, as this book shows you, women face different kinds of problems. They're oppressed in different ways. And it just gives you the complexity of the wholeness of that situation. You can look at a lot of different tensions in this book. One is what's interesting to me, the establishment of Convent and Ruby as utopias and havens for uh, women and for Black Americans, respectively. And then she sets up this tension between the two. And this is something that has gone on in critical circles, this discussion about the tension between being Black and also being a woman. So this book actually sets it up in this way structurally to have tension between these two sides of one person. Another thing that's interesting about this book is how it's a novel of oppositions. You can see like the young and the old at that time in the 70s, women and men, community and individuality, violence versus resistance. So that's quite interesting, especially if you look at this book as a novel of that time. So there are actually a lot of critical approaches that one can take with this book, even though, as we discussed earlier, that it is quite confusing. It is very complex and it invites readers to think about it critically, which is more than you can say for other books that we've read.
One of the things that I often appreciate in people's works, and something that Toni Morrison has a lot of, is the supernatural. But it's her brand of supernatural elements are not like most other supernatural elements. And that is one of the things that's always frustrated me. And I think that is more of a cultural thing. But from a literary standpoint, it does make for interesting questions, at least. It gets me thinking and it gets me wondering why she's using these supernatural elements.
So that's something you want to explore further, perhaps next week.
Yeah, and also how those things may relate to religion. Because, as you pointed out, there is interesting conflicts here between different factions, and I think religion and spirituality are two very different things in this book, and that's something I think we'll also talk about next week.
I think we also probably need to take a closer look at race in general because obviously Morrison focuses so heavily on race. I think that it's worth looking at this novel from the perspective of critical race theory, which is a very important, especially right now at this moment, kind of way of examining race that I think will offer us a lot of further insight into this novel and why it might be important. And we will definitely take a look at that in a future episode.
All right, we'll be right back. When we come back, we'll talk about whether this book belongs in the canon. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, we talked about why this book is important, and we also talked about how this book is not as well regarded as Morrison's other books. Do you think this book belongs in the canon? You know, given the limited amount of time that people have to read and to study, is this book worthy of study?
Keeping in mind what I said earlier about not remembering very well the other books I've read of
Yeah.
hers, um, the thing that makes this hard to teach is also, I think, one of the things that makes this potentially really interesting to teach, in that there aren't really simple answers. There's a lot of questions, there are a lot of confusing aspects to it. And I think that makes for maybe a more rewarding digging process, a more challenging process of discovery and figuring out what this book is about, what Morrison is trying to say about these different things. So, yes, I think it does belong in the canon.
I think the novel offers two things that are pretty unique and important that justify its place in syllabi. The first is that it documents part of American history of these all black towns, which I think is underexplored in fiction. And so I think that's important in itself. But I think even more important is probably the way that the novel explores that intersection between race and gender, because it does explore, as you'd mentioned, the difference between being a black person and being a black woman. And that to me, I think, is incredibly significant and makes the book worth reading and studying.
Yeah, I agree. I really wish that I had a better recollection of the other books. You know, it's just hard because I think if you were doing a seminar on Morrison, then you would probably do a beloved trilogy study, right? And you would read all three. A lot of the ideas present here are present in her other works, as you've mentioned before, Yed. So I don't know. I think that this book is definitely important, and it's different enough that one should read it if one is intending to read Morrison, but it just depends on how much time you have. I wouldn't put this above Beloved, for example. I think that if you are a literate person who's interested in reading American literature, you kind of have to read Beloved, right? Like it is the book of Morrison's that's talked about the most. And if your goal is to have a well rounded understanding of American literature, you just have to read Beloved. That's in the canon.
One of the things that I came across while researching this book is that this is one of only two of her books that takes place during her lifetime. Most of the time, she is working with the Jim Crow South or during slavery. And to bring back what Iad said, this is about things that I didn't know anything about. I didn't know anything about the all black towns of the Plain States, specifically of Oklahoma. And I've never seen this in any other fiction before.
So, setting aside academia, one of the interesting things about this book is that this book was published around the time she won the Nobel, I think, and her work was popularized by Oprah's book club. So people who wouldn't usually read literature, they were reading Morrison's work. Do you think that this book has that kind of widespread appeal? And would you recommend this book to someone who is not very academic?
I don't know that it actually does have widespread appeal per se, and I don't think, even though it was on Oprah's list, I don't know that her readership actually enjoyed this book as a whole. From what I've read, that's what I've gathered, that this frustrated a lot of people.
I think that the mass American reader has very little time for art with a capital A, and I think that's what this novel is. But I think because people see Toni Morrison's name on the cover and they know that this is about something very serious, they are more willing to explore, or at least pay lip service to the artifice of the novel than they would if it came from somebody unknown.
I think that's right. And as I was saying earlier, she doesn't pull punches. She's not concerned about making you like her, I guess. She's not in it for a enjoyable experience. So I think a lot of readers, like you said, Ed, are coming to her with an expectation of capital A art.
I read quite a few interviews with her, and it is really interesting because when she was at the peak of her fame, which was, in the early 2000s, late 90s, she was like a cultural phenomenon. And so, she would go to these town halls and people would just ask questions and they've been transcribed. And I remember one person said, my two favorite books of yours are Beloved and Paradise because they are both really complicated and I had to read them again and again, which is probably a minority opinion. But it is interesting that, if you present a writer as important and it's pushed by the Oprah PR machine telling you it's important, you have to read this, then people will put up with a difficult book. I imagine it's the same if Faulkner, for example, got super famous and then everyone said, well, you have to read Faulkner. Then people would read Faulkner and say, oh, yeah, this is important. I agree with what both of you guys are saying, but it's like if you have Oprah behind you, then people will put up with it, People will find a way to justify reading it, even if they don't really get it.
It's like Radiohead or the Bible. Like, people have enough space in their lives for X number of serious things. And Radiohead is very lucky that they get to be the serious band that people are into. And the Bible, for a lot of people, is the serious book that they're into. And Morrison is very lucky that Oprah Winfrey allowed her to be the serious writer that most readers are into.
Let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with Paradise, you can let us know on Reddit. That link is below. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. If you'd like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That's in the episode description as well. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. We'll be back next week and the one after with 2 episodes about Paradise. So we hope you'll join us for those 2 discussions as well. If you'd like to read this book, go ahead and find a copy. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.